the Good afternoon. I'm Leah Smiley with the Society for Diversity, and I'm excited to be here and talk about this fantastic conversation, this fantastic presentation that Dr. Lee and I have prepared for you all. Um, I know that some of you may be concerned about many of the news reports that we have seen um, up until in the last 5 days of this new year. But we're going to focus on the future, and I want you all to really focus on what's ahead and not on the things that are behind. One of the reasons why I wanted to still do this webinar, in spite of all the news reports that have been coming out over the last couple of days, is because it's very important for us to really stay focused. And I know it's hard to hear that right now. I know it may be hard to do that, especially with all the challenges that are going on in this DEI industry. But if we're not focused, then we're going to put ourselves in the at a disadvantage of trying to fix things later on. So this session today is going to be a little forward thinking. And I'm going to hopefully talk about some things that are forward thinking. Dr. Lee is going to talk about some different ideas, and we want to motivate you all to really pivot from a lot of the challenges to really thinking about how we can take our work to the next level. And this is going to be a um, I'll say, a very important component of doing that. So our topic today is global ESG and DEIA risk management. One of the things that um, we want to do as we're looking towards the future is really be more intentional about including accessibility and thinking about accessibility, especially as we're talking about the environment. Um, a big challenge in the environment is that oftentimes when we think about accessibility, it is an afterthought and not a forethought. So we want to make it so that we're including that topic in this conversation as we're going along. With me today, I have Dr. Delmar Lee. And Dr. Lee, do you have any opening words for us this morning?
Certainly. First of all, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are geographically. We're going to be talking about ESG and its impact globally, and then basically how the future work is going to be impacted by considering it as we do our DEIA efforts everywhere that we are. I want you all to pay specifically, and if you've instructed with me or been with me as I facilitate, I'm a stickler for paying attention to the words that are used because I believe that as the language goes, so goes the thinking, and so goes the thinking, so goes your actions. ESG is about environmental, social, and corporate governance. The environmental piece, I like to say, is abundantly clear. We have been hearing rumbles about that probably for at least 60 years. It's now becoming so loud that you can't ignore it. And we have an entire generation of workers and activists who are not letting their voices be silenced because of how important it really is. That the S part is where DEIA rests, and we're going to get into that in our discussion and our conversation. And critical to operationalizing both of those is responsible corporate governance. So we're going to use the language of DEIA, and we're going to talk about it through the lens of leadership and the importance of every person being involved in ensuring that the work that we've started is conducted the right way.
All right. And with that, let us get into the presentation. And I'm going to enable the captions. So when we talk about this issue of the environment, there are a lot of individuals who may not necessarily be as familiar with this topic for many different reasons. And certainly in the course of our traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we have kind of focused on the things that have been really, really important to us. And certainly where this work is heading is making it so that we're focusing on the things that are very important to the next generation. In the past, we have really done DEIA work from the perspective of everyone has to do it, right? But I want to kind of challenge you all to think about this from a different perspective today. And that is, um, for the most part, there are going to be some organizations who dig in and say, hey, we refuse to do this DEIA stuff. We refuse to do ESG. We refuse to talk about the environment or um, corporate, and social governance. We refuse to go ahead and move forward. And that's okay. And we as a DIA industry have to be okay with that. Some of those organizations, however, will not survive, and they have to be okay with that. We're really looking to help those organizations that want to develop a pathway to the future. And they want to experience some of those successes. So, we're going to talk today about the challenges that lie ahead of corporations. And I think it's going to be important for us to distinguish between the corporations here in the US and the corporations that are in other nations, because there are some unique challenges that face the United States. And then we'll look at DIA and its connection to ESG and talk about the triad as well as look at risk management. So, some of you may remember a couple of years ago, um, ESG started to pick up a lot of steam around the same time that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility was making gains. And one of the things that happened um, simultaneously when you had George Floyd's murder, you also had a lot of organizations saying, hey, in order for us to connect to this next generation, we're going to have to start doing more in the ESG sector. And you saw that companies were starting to adopt more proactive stances on ESG. They were looking to develop products that focused on the environment. They also sought to get on indices that were basically rating how companies were performing in respect to ESG. But one thing that happened was that um, one big thing that happened was that Elon Musk um, and Tesla was rated on a low scale um, when it came to their environmental efforts, and partly because uh, Tesla has done very well in terms of promoting the electricity, but in electric automobiles, but it hasn't done as well in terms of the transparency portion under corporate governance. It hasn't done as well in the diversity area. And certainly, they wanted to be recognized as having good marks in all of the areas because of their significant work in the environment. So, um, what happened was basically he protested his company not being ranked in the top five of this major environmental index. And from there, a lot of other people began to protest because they said, hey, there are non-standard ways that ESG uh, these ESG indexes are measuring impact. And because everyone's not using the same standards, therefore we're not going to pay attention to any of the standards. And then you had simultaneously here in the US a revolt from investors. And the investors said, if it doesn't add to the bottom line, then we're not going to reward companies that pursue ESG efforts. So now you have this backlash against DEI and backlash against ESG at the same time. And because many of us DEI leaders have been focused on the circus that has been involved with this environmental effort, with this DIA effort, we haven't really focused as much on ESG. And meanwhile, other countries outside of the US have been moving forward with ESG. And they do note this is something that is a global phenomenon, and that the US in particular has had a lot of opposition to ESG. So recently, you have had some companies doing rollbacks and saying, hey, we're going to pull back on these ESG efforts because the standards to evaluate companies' efforts are not the same. And investors don't see the bottom line impact today. As a result, you had companies saying, hey, we're pulling back. Then something happened. We started having more environmental disasters. And there were reports that demonstrated that the cost for not implementing environmental controls and managing risks pertaining to the environment was costing organizations billions of dollars. And that was just last year alone, right? So while people were saying, hey, it doesn't impact the bottom line, yeah, it does, because it's going to cost you something. And the costs have hit everyone from organizations um, like AT&T, which has to remove um, these uh, these telephone poles that have lead in them in communities. They have to remove the poles all over the U.S., and it's going to cost a fortune. To You see flooding, fires, wildfires, and all sorts of different things that are happening that are impacting the bottom line. Even in places like Florida, you have insurance companies that are saying, we are not going to insure certain homes because of these environmental risks. Dr. Lee, do you want to add something?
Absolutely. I was sitting here smiling because I was about to praise you because I'm gonna tell everybody my leader is awesome. So if you see me smile, it's because she says things, and I always feel like I'm limited in what I should say because there's so much to say. I want to go back and address a couple of things that Leah mentioned kind of cursorily, and I want to mention them more specifically. When Leah was talking about this ESG thing being a global phenomenon and the reticence of the people in the United States, businesses in the United States, to not want to acknowledge and accept the necessity of valuing the need for ESG, the pressure is going to come specifically from the EU. There's something called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that goes into effect today, January 5th, 2024. It's not new. Leah mentioned that Elon Musk's company were concerns that Tesla was rated low on an index. That index is the S&P, I think it's Standards and Poor ESG rating. And it's not new. This thing we're talking about now was introduced in 2005. We have 50,000 companies in the EU who already signed on and is already working on it. Through the processes that's coming through these called the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is going to require concrete evidence in the form of a scorecard that's produced and governed by an audit of a third party. Now, historically, there are companies in the United States, as I said, who's already a part of this, 3,000 of them. Lesser known by people who don't watch out for this kind of stuff, because it gets very kind of ethereal because they start talking about the investment possibilities, and they speak in very large financial terms that will cause people to either get bored to death, go to sleep, or become disinterested. But because it is a multi-trillion-dollar investment, the people who understand what real money looks like are paying attention. Microsoft is ranked #1, by the way, on this index by the S&P. So, and a lot of banks are ranked in the top 10. So it's not like the major entities are not participating and are not aware. It's just that you have people push back, like Elon Musk, and I forget the person you put the article in yesterday about Lululemon, I think it was, companies like that. We're trying to ignore the necessity of it. But as Leah also mentioned, we have an entire generation, young millennials, Zoomers, and believe it or not, older boomers have also realized the importance of this. And now it's inescapable and it has to be dealt with. Through the processes that are going to be introduced from the EU, the pressure is going to be applied to the US to comply, because if they're doing any kind of business with the EU, they're going to be forced to produce this thing. Like I said, that goes into effect today, January 5th. So now it's not only going to be reportable, you just can't make up numbers, because there will be a formal audit, just like you would for a CPA auditing any other business in the United States, except this one is going to impact the availability of resources to those very companies who are denying the importance of it. So we're talking about not billions, trillions. So yes, you're going to get pushback, especially from people who don't want to be governed. And this ESG, the governance piece, is fundamental because it points clearly to the responsibility of the leaderships.
Right. So, in years past, we have had individuals that have resisted being accountable for their company's environmental decisions. And one of the things that is going to change under the corporate governance area is that there has to be accountability, transparency, as well as a focus on the culture of, and I'll say honesty, right? So, and this honesty piece is important because honesty is what leads to trust. And in order for ESG to be a viable component of an organization's strategy, you have to have trust. People have to be able to trust that your organization is looking out for the best interests of the future generation. And this is where, again, it goes back to all of these DEIA initiatives that we've been implementing for many, many years that have really focused on helping people to build trust with different groups. So if you think about the environment, who would not trust people who are trying to do things with the environment? I'll tell you, people who are low income, individuals who are people of color, perhaps Black. There was a post on Twitter or X the other day where a young lady, Generation Z young lady, she said, "We haven't had clean water in our town in Flint, Michigan for over 10 years, and nobody is talking about it."
Hmm.
So when you think about this issue of clean water is something that has not only impacted Flint, Michigan, but it is impacting towns in uh, the southern United States, and cities. It's going to impact a lot of different areas. And as we're talking about this and we're looking at trust, you're going to have people that say, I don't trust what these organizations and politicians will do because of this issue of the fact that some of this stuff is long standing,
Hmm.
right? And no one is dealing with it. We've had several years of elections, and no one has taken this on as an election component. Why? Because the people who live there aren't the dominant group, right? They're it's not, and don't get me wrong, the majority isn't the dominant group. Now, we do have a lot of people in Flint, Michigan who are white, but when we look at the intersectionality of those individuals, 40% of the town consists of individuals who are low income and white, which means that they don't have the privilege of someone who may live in a suburb and may have, um, I'll say, the ability to move to a different town, right? So this is something when we're talking about privilege, we don't want to just talk about privilege from the racial perspective, because privilege is something that has an impact on people depending on where you live, what your income status is. When I say where you live, I mean if you live in a rural area or if you live in an older suburban area. Uh, those those geographic demographics have a impact on whether or not people pay attention to you, regardless of the color of your skin. The other thing that I want you all to keep in mind when it comes to trust is people who have disabilities. Now, a person who has a disability may not trust um, the decision makers or government leaders or even corporations when they are talking about their environmental efforts. So, if you think about recovery plans, oftentimes they don't include people with disabilities. Evacuation plans may not include people with disabilities. Even being able to think about how we are going to plan for a season of wildfires. That conversation often neglects to include people who have disabilities. So we want to really help organizations to think about this trust factor, and the fact that honesty goes along with trust. Honesty says, "Look, we made mistakes. We got it wrong. We neglected this group. We, when it comes to our Native individuals, maybe our communication, the individuals who were Native American, maybe our communications weren't that good, right? We spent a lot of time communicating to people who spoke English, but perhaps we didn't spend as much time communicating to individuals whose first language is not English, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to be talking about as we're building trust, because the honesty portion says we haven't done a good job in this before, but here's where we are making changes. The problem is not that you haven't. The problem is not that you find discrimination or bias or any of those things, right? The problem is when you find it, it's the fact that you don't do anything about it. And that's where we have to make those changes if we're going to really be honest about building a sustainable strategy for the environment, for social good, and for corporate governance. That honesty that leads to trust has to be a part of the conversation. And I know a lot of organizations will say, well, from a risk management perspective, we don't want to admit that we've made mistakes. We don't want to admit that there's failure. But that's a part of the growth, right? Where we can have people who are leaders, I'll say leaders, who are willing to grow and to admit that, hey, we've made some mistakes, we got it wrong. And this goes back to um, our our work as DEI leaders, and making it so that we are talking about courage, not just the courage to be honest, but the courage to face some challenges that we traditionally don't like to face when we're talking about diverse groups and uh, this idea of accessibility and inclusion and equity under the S component of of environmental, social, and corporate governance. Dr. Lee, did you want to add something?
Yes. Let's see. Where do I start? Okay. I'm going to go back a little bit, then I'm going to come forward. Um, in 2023, there was an estimated 8 billion people on this planet. Those of us and others who are scientific minded, those who are reasonable, and people who understand know that there must be better steward of our natural resources. Leah spoke about the water problem in Flint, Michigan. That's just one of among many problems that have been caused by businesses acting unabated because there has been no transparency. There has been no reporting mechanism because the numbers that they reported were numbers that they wanted to be known, not the actual numbers. The trust that Leah talks about is absolutely essential. The reason for these directives that's coming out of the EU is because they realized the numbers that were being reported were not valid, that the trust is necessary for businesses to feel comfortable investing in other businesses was actually compromised. And the reason for, again, the pushback is because now with accountability being provided in a quantifiable, concrete format, businesses can now be held accountable for the things that they do. Another thing I wanted to go back to was Leah mentioning, and these are my words interpretation, but Leah said, not allowing our conversation or our narrative to be reduced to what's called incremental representation, where we're looking at pieces of a person as it is involved in our conversation in ESG and DEIA or anything else. The intersectional piece is what we need to focus on, such that the holistic part of a person can be appreciated. Now, the S in the middle of all of this, I like that, is the social piece. It is DEIA. It is what this whole conversation is really all about. This is about people, the environment affecting people, the governance affecting people. This is not to neglect or to, as I say, disregard the reason for businesses existing, which is profit. What is necessary is that we maintain that balance where there isn't an over exaggerated emphasis on either of the three to the disadvantage of the ones that are disregarded. As I said before, the critical part of making this whole thing work and realizing the value of people while respecting the planet, what we call a triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, is understanding responsible governance. That's all I'll leave for now.
Okay, good. So, to build on what Dr. Lee talked about, we want to make it so that we're not limiting our conversation about um, different groups and the impact that the environment has on different groups to what we may know about those different groups. For example, when it comes to individuals who perhaps um, may be different religions. We may not be aware of their um, philosophy in terms of the holistic component of the environment and the impacts that that has on their group, right? Or, and I'll use an example. There are some religions that really heavily focus on nature, and when you're looking at the impact of nature and what happens when nature turns violent, there are some people who have uh, religious traditions or religious beliefs as to why that has happened. And we have to really be attuned to all of these different factors, not just from the perspective of, what we know, right? But from the perspective of what they know. And this requires us to engage in communication with different groups. Certainly, as you're trying to navigate through environmental concerns, and you are perhaps um, nearby a Native American tribe, or perhaps an Aboriginal group in your country, you may want to find out what are their thoughts and what are their concerns about some of the environmental factors. And this is where, and a lot of people will say, well, we don't know how to reach out to these Native American groups or to these Aboriginal groups. Right, you don't know how. So why don't you recruit some people who do know how? Recruit that staff, those staff members. And this is the business case, right? Because as we're looking towards the future of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility work, we do have to have that representation to ensure that we can have what I'll call holistic conversations, not just about our um, our inclusion efforts in the workplace, but have holistic conversations about our product designs and our um, ESG plans that will ultimately impact these diverse communities. And again, we kind of go about, as Dr. Lee said a little earlier, we go about this work and segment our performance in the work and keep everything separate. Like we say, okay, here's DEIA, here's ESG, here's our corporate, strategy, here's this other area, here are the shareholders, here are all these different groups, right? And everything is separate. It's necessary for us to begin making the connections, right? This is
Yep.
where DIA leaders come in, because we can help make the connections to help people see it's all related, right? This whole conversation about generational preferences. The younger generation, they're not going to understand why you don't have environmental protections and you're not talking about risk management with the environment. They're not going to understand all that stuff. They're not going to listen to the fact that you've known for the last 30 or 40 years that this was a potential risk and you've done nothing about it, right? They're not going to understand that. The only people who understand perhaps are the older folks who say, yeah, well, you know what? We knew about it, but we didn't have to do anything about it today. That's the same thing with those oil spills that we had. We knew that there was a risk of an oil spill, and we knew we had to clean it up, or we knew we had to do better at cleaning it up, but it's not for us to concern ourselves with today because it'll be too expensive for us to deal with, right? So folks, yeah, this next generation of people, they're not going to understand that. They're just not. So This is where we are going to have to get a little more proactive and helping people to make those connections and say, hey, this is all related. This is not something that is standalone. And you can look at recruiting as just being something that's performative. We need to make it so that we're connecting all the dots because a lot of folks don't see the need to connect the dots. And this is where we can be more intentional about addressing the environment and talking about the social good that people expect. And social good is not just your donations and giving, good donations to different organizations who perhaps um, talk to or work with homeless individuals. Yes, there is that I'm sorry, unhoused individuals. There is that component that addresses unhoused individuals, especially when there are environmental disasters or environmental concerns. But let's try to think about how we can make the connection more explicit and really working, including those nonprofit organizations who deal with unhoused persons when we're doing our planning for environmental work, right? Let's include them at the table and not just give money to them. This is, again, a change in strategy where we are trying to gain insight into some of their challenges and concerns and not just thinking if we throw money at the problem, that's going to be sufficient to fix it. No, let's go beyond throwing money at the problem by giving the nonprofit organization a donation for their work with unhoused organizations. Let's talk about how those unhoused populations are impacted by perhaps the environment. Let's talk about how mental health ties into those unhoused individuals and their prospects for uh, gaining secure futures, right? Let's talk about where we can perhaps integrate strategies to ensure that our office parks are safe when people are going to work. Let's talk about that safety feature. Let's not look at it as all being disconnected because when we're looking at safety as being a disconnected component from um, the big population of unhoused people and being disconnected from the environmental changes and corporate layoffs and all sorts of different and unfair pay and everything like that, we're looking at it and throwing money at little pieces, but it doesn't have the impact that we really need it to have. So we want to make it so that our work is crossing all of the pillars, right? That we're talking about our work from the perspective of how we can make it so that we take this to the next level and check all of the so-called boxes where we're saying, okay, we're going to talk about a holistic approach to really dealing with some of the issues that our city faces, our state faces, our country faces, our region faces, and we're also not looking at this as being a standalone initiative like people used to approach DEI. It's 2024. And it's time that we start integrating and connecting our work, right? That we're integrating and aligning the work so that we can get better results.
Can I add something there, Leah? Because I think
Yes.
you're about the I'm gonna go back again because I missed the point where you brought up the transparency piece and its connection to trust and honesty. We need to understand that the transparency thing that we keep talking about for our leadership and the governance piece of ESG have historically been problematic because uh, power, rests in that invisibility. The privilege that Leah mentioned rests in that invisibility. The transparency that we're requesting allows us to see how the decisions are made. What is it that actually governs a leader of whatever industry deciding that he, she, or they can perform in a certain way? Leah mentioned being performative. The reason why this directive coming out of the EU is so powerful is because it removes the possibility of pretending that you're doing something when in fact it was designed to look good and do nothing. That's what performative is. By having a quantifiable measure that has an audit component that's conducted by a third party. I mean, we all understand corruption can creep into anywhere, but we're talking about increasing the probability of honest reporting being conducted such that real decisions can be made. And not just for the accountability piece, but for the success of the three things mentioned here, for the recruitment, retention, and engagement of top talent. Because people want to contribute to something that is good. Those of you who have learned with me, as I learned with you, I always said I'm the quintessential optimist. I want to believe that people who are put in the awesome responsibility of being a CEO or a president or the owner of a business is trying to do something good. The question is, are they afforded the information to make informed and better decisions such that when they do decide to co-sign something, it is in fact designed to benefit all three legs of what we're calling the triad or the pillars. That is the environment, the social aspect, and the governance aspect. Now, I think what's also interesting is if you pay attention, there's been a real hard push to make DEI go away, but it can't because it's intricately involved in the S part of ESG. What they pushed away made the ESG that much more important. Because as I said before, there are companies, there are investment firms, Wall Street, pick one of them, Bloomberg. They're all looking at this ESG rating for businesses for the honesty component, for the certainty that they're paying attention to the concern for the environment because there's a groundswell. Leah pointed to Generation Z. I like to say it wasn't just them. I'm going to say the millennials. I'm going to say the boomers. I'm going to say there's been a consciousness for every person who's on this earth, but there hasn't been support for what they wanted to do. And now that there's a compelling reason coming from outside, external pressure, we're going to see real effort being made towards satisfying the thing that is best for all three, to where you can have a successful business, where you understand and appreciate the value of people, where we respect our natural resources. Because to be quite honest, without the resources that we've been talking about, that everyone's been jumping up and down and saying we need to do something about global warming, there is such a thing, watch our emissions. Without it, none of the other things can exist. So when we say that there should be a balanced approach to appreciating ESG, that is exactly what we mean. Because too much emphasis on any one of them is going to cause a corresponding problem in the other two.
Right.
Okay, Leah.
We have a
That
question.
is okay. Amber, can you read that question?
Yes. Completely agree with the holistic approach and the need to ensure DEIA is not a standalone initiative. How do we then combat all of the political headwinds that are discrediting both ESG and DEIA?
I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Um, that is such a good question. So, one of the things that I think is very important for us to really do is make it so that we don't get distracted. And what I mean by not getting distracted is that um, we, right now, there is a push to, I'll say, um, define the narrative for us. And we have to take back control of the narrative and really talk about what it is that we are supposed to be doing, and what our purpose and objective is. Because by us, I'll say, being distracted with the distractors, who are ultimately trying to control the narrative, we're kind of giving our power away. And I've always said, when we talk about racism, and folks will tell me, oh, Leah, Black people can't be racist because Black people don't have power. I say, who? What? Who? Or people of color don't have power? Who made you give your power away? And one of the things that I want you all to keep in mind is that we don't have to give our power away to the individuals who are trying to distract us. Um, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this webinar today on the environment, on ESG. It's no coincidence that today is the day that the legislation in the the regulations in the EU go into effect. It's no coincidence that um, this work is so important, and it will be important. And even if people change the name from DEIA, they want to play word bingo, the work still has to get done. So um, let's really not focus on minuscule things like changing the name, because that takes away from our focus. Let's not get distracted by the people who are trying to redefine the narrative, right? Um, let's make it so that we take our power and use it wisely. What does that look like? It looks like us being able to model um, what it is that we are encouraging everyone else to do. And that is for us to constantly make changes to our process and make adjustments to the way that we're going about doing this work. And to say, you know what? I've had conversations talking to different people and saying, I've had conversations with these different individuals, and here's how I think our work should change, right? Not just changing the name, because that doesn't mean as much as changing our approach and changing our strategy. So saying, here's how we're going to change our approach, here's how we're going to change our strategy, and being able to talk to not only your senior leaders about it, get their input, but talk to supervisors as well, and make it so that they're aware of the wide range of issues that are facing the organization. So let's not focus on changing the the letters or changing the name of diversity as much as we're changing our approach and changing our strategy, and making it so that we are communicating what that strategic focus will be. And then making it so that we talk about the wide range of issues that are facing the organization. Because, see, one of the reasons why people have everything that's disconnected is because they're not quite sure about how DEIA impacts everything in the organization. They're just thinking about it in terms of recruiting and training.
Mhm.
And when you
Mhm.
limit it to those two buckets, what you have is all of these other areas that are left unaddressed. So let's say you work for a healthcare organization. And as you're working for a healthcare organization, um, they're thinking, okay, well, we're not going to be able to recruit these diverse people. We're not going to be able to recruit, or retain diverse individuals. Hey, we'll just fire them. But here's the thing: you want to look at the fact that when we're talking about healthcare, one big issue is the fact that women are dying before, during, and after childbirth at high rates. And this is something that almost every state, especially those red states, are facing as they're looking at the impact of these abortion bills, right? Women are dying, and you're not going to be able to, um, increase your population or anything like that if women are dying. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but certainly, yeah, it's not going to happen. So you need to be able to think about, okay, how is that connected? What's happening? Do we not have enough providers who are female? Are we not offering enough interventions? Um, how does that have an impact when we have even environmental disasters in this area? For instance, a tornado. Is our healthcare institution prepared to deal with these issues when we have perhaps tornadoes in these areas where we typically or previously did not have tornadoes? Um, when we're talking about trust, is it that is are a certain percentage of people um, being impacted when it comes to uh, a certain disease perhaps creeping in and killing more people or impacting more people than others, right? Especially when we're talking about things like cancer, and the fact that perhaps certain cancers impact certain communities more than they do others, right? So we want to really take a holistic approach to this idea of not just thinking about healthcare from the perspective of, hey, we got to hire these Black people. We're just going to perform by, saying, well, we can't hire Black people right now or hire Latinos right now. We can't hire individuals who perhaps speak Mandarin Chinese right now because we just don't have the budget. Well, it has an impact on everything from those environmental issues to women giving childbirth to perhaps diseases and sicknesses that impact certain communities. It has an impact on everything. So let's not just put it to the side and look at it like it's a standalone component. It's a whole, it impacts every aspect of our work, right? And being able to make the connection between representation and your staffing models, to representation in your patients, to representation when it comes to perhaps your volunteers in all areas of your healthcare model, and really talking about that from a strategic perspective, because right now people are compartmentalizing things, right? They're thinking, okay, well, we're just talking about LGBTQ, we're just talking about uh, people of color, we're just talking about women. No, we're talking about much more than that. We're talking about husbands that are or partners that are males that will now have to raise children by themselves, where and that will be the sole primary, sole caregiver in their family, right? We're talking about local impacts in communities in a major way. So let's not just compartmentalize the work that we're doing and thinking that it is not necessary because of X, Y, and Z, because there's backlash. Let's talk about this. And it may require that you sit down with some people in your industry, right? So you may have to, send a message to Amber and say, Amber, this, are there any other people in my industry who are working in this? And let's have like an industry communication for how we're all going to go about approaching this from a strategic perspective, right? So everybody in our industry can come together and say, hey, let's try to tackle this. And we're going to do take the same approach in all of our organizations. And we can work out something that will help us to make more progress together versus us trying to come up with ideas on our own. right? And thinking about it from that perspective. But you have to have the strategy. You need to, and that strategy includes the new approach, the different approach. You have to have the communications that are both internal and external. And you also need to be able to think about this from an industry perspective. Because if you can use that industry data and talk about those benchmarks and talk about what other people in your industry are doing, you have a better chance of really helping people to refocus and changing that narrative. Dr. Lee, did you want to add something?
Yes, I want to circle back a little bit. First of all, I love questions. So hopefully you love questions. I'm going to volunteer. We love questions. Ask more questions because um, this is how we're able to give you what you need to connect all this information in a meaningful way, where when you leave this session, you have something you can work with. The other thing, so how do you approach people, or how do you approach the powers that be, leadership, whoever? My thing is say something. But here's what's required. First of all, I want you to be informed as much as you can. You have to read broadly, attend sessions like this, get in a mindset of learning to ask better questions than answering allegations, whatever the situation may be, and read, get involved. And the other thing I like to share is you got to take care of yourself, because if you're not in the right headspace, regardless of how I'm going to say careful you might want to articulate your message to ensure that what you wanting to convey is understood. If you haven't taken care of yourself, you won't be able to do it. So there's that piece that a lot of times we neglect. We get so involved in trying to solve problems that we forget that unless we take care of ourselves, we won't have the energy, we won't have the mind space, the bandwidth to deal with the problem. Because what we're dealing with is very complex. Remember, you're talking about dealing with human personalities. You're talking about dealing with egos. You're talking about dealing with people who, when you approach them about a concern, they see it as an attack on their personness. If you have not taken care of yourself, you will be triggered and you will react in a way that disadvantages the reason for you being there. There might have been an opportunity for you to make a real difference. So how do you handle a situation like this? Inform yourself. You have to read broadly. You have to learn to question, not from the perspective of I'm going to say antagonizing people, but from genuine curiosity. The things that tends to be educated out of us, because with real curiosity, you can get to some real answers that make a real difference. But to get there, again, the questioning is required. Being informed is necessary. So when the time comes and you have the opportunity to speak, first of all, don't get mad. Because if you, I I like to tell everybody who learns with me, what we do is very emotionally driven. But what's required is a pragmatic approach to an emotional situation. Because if your emotions get hijacked, thinking process is shut down. We were looking at a critical part of business and industry that is unarguable is it can't happen without people. We understand that 80% of businesses is structures and systems, but that other critical 20% are the people. DEIA, ESG, corporate social responsibility. Pick one up, any one you want. The critical part of operationalizing it to make it become a real thing that's going to be beneficial is appreciating the people. When you start talking to people, regardless of their station, whether they're the CEO, the president, or someone who's working beside you, or maybe beneath you, understanding how to have a conversation with them, being able to communicate them on a very profound way, has the possibility of making the change that we've been talking about, to where it is inescapable and people want to participate and want to hear your perspective. But take the time to inform yourself. And then when you are required to speak, have something to say.
Hi, we
That's
have a
great.
comment in the chat that I'd like to read. It's from Tina. Thank you. As Dr. Lee mentioned, language is important. I appreciate your guidance on maintaining focus, on owning and making the connection to define what we do and to show how that connects and links to ESG and the broader bottom line impact for companies and organizations. We have to show and articulate the links explicitly.
Indeed. Well said, Tina.
All right. So I'm going to head back to the slides here. One of the things that I want you all to think about as we're talking about what needs to happen and where we need to take this work is we have to begin to identify and implement change strategies. And those change strategies will include exploring things such as the business case for ESG as well as DEIA. And that business case should always pertain to the bottom line. As Dr. Lee said, you have to read broadly, inform yourself, ask questions, but you also have to make that a connection clear between the value of doing uh, ESG and DEI versus just saying, hey, we should do this and we should go in this direction. Because just having your knowledge and your expertise is not enough. You need to have documented value for the business. We also have to start talking about the evolution of management and how that management part has changed when it comes to transparency, building trust and having honesty and also being accountable. Those areas are very, very important when we look at how management has changed. We're no longer talking about managers and executives who are going to be rewarded for hiding things that are detrimental to the business. We're looking at how organizations, how people expect management teams to lead better. We also want to talk about the environmental impact on mental health and well-being. That is something that we don't talk enough about. If you think about all the losses that we've had during COVID, the losses of people, and then when you couple that with some of the um, environmental losses that we've had, where people have lost homes, they have lost everything that they've owned, they have lost all sorts of different things. From a mental health and well-being perspective, that can take its toll when you're dealing with loss of life and perhaps loss of property. And we want to be able to have those conversations in addition to taking care of yourself. We want to align the culture with ESG goals as well, where we can have the organization identify those ESG goals, but most importantly, think about how our organizational culture needs to be aligned with that. The organizational culture is the way things are done around here. And as we're talking about how things are done, let's not just think about recycling, but how do we also take our work to the next level in terms of research and development and coming up with innovative products and new ideas? How do we make it so that we are having those conversations and allowing for experimentation and uh, ideation and creativity and all sorts of different areas that need to have diversity of thought and representation in order to be successful. Um, we also have to look at what the generations want, right? So we're not just going to be able to talk about those uh, Zoomers and the millennials and Generation Xers. You may also have to look at um, those generations, perhaps those baby boomers or those Generation Xers that also don't want to move forward with ESG. So perhaps you take a balanced approach. You offer a little bit of something for everyone, right? And this is where we are going to be more intentional about planning and preparing a multi-generational approach. And then we want to ensure that we're measuring for success. And what do those measures look like, right? Again, there are a lot of indexes that are ultimately helping people to measure what is going to be important as they move forward with ESG, take a look at what those indexes are ultimately going to be asking for and what they are seeking to measure. So before you start making a whole bunch of changes, let's really think about what those indexes are looking for and how we can be more intentional about not just ensuring compliance, but going above and beyond what is required for us.
Leah, we
And
have a
then,
question.
okay, go ahead.
Leah and Dr. Lee, thank you for sharing this presentation today. I'm in a new county DEI administrator leadership role as a first. What should I do? Should I be sharing with our strategic planning and resilience departments about ESG and community engagement? We are providing wraparound services for the community. I'm starting to do community listening tours now.
Yes. So your approach is great in terms of starting out with the community listening tours. And then with the results of your community listening tours, you want to consolidate that data so that you can perhaps put it in buckets that people or themes, I'll call it themes or buckets that people can so that people can see the connection, right? And also make the connection clear. Like, let's say for our county, here's what is, um, concerning to people in this bucket. And as we're thinking about helping this county to be a great place to live, work, and do business, these are the areas that it's related to, right? So again, making that connection explicit and not leaving it to their imagination to allow them to connect the dots on their own because they never connect the dots on their own, okay? So you want to make that explicit connection and then sharing that information and allowing people to kind of digest it and come up with thoughts and then presenting it to your leadership team. Presenting it to those, because again, it's not just about us collecting information and reading broadly and getting smart just for the purposes of being smart. We want our leadership teams to take intentional actions that will ultimately ensure that we are able to make an impact in the way that in a way that will prepare our organizations for the future workplace and the expectations that people have for their communities, right? And certainly the path that you're going on is perfect. And just making it so that you do a good job of communicating all of the steps in your process to those key stakeholders, because that is ultimately going to make it so that they can trust you. So, this whole idea of trust is very important, not just for those other people, but it's also important for us in this DEI industry because there's a lot of folks who don't trust us. And we have to acknowledge the fact that they don't trust us, right? And the way that we build trust is by, again, building those relationships, being honest, and demonstrating that we, and demonstrating that we control the narrative. The reason why people don't trust us is because of the narrative that exists out there. And we have to make sure that we are taking control of that narrative and that we are communicating, here's what our intentions are, and here's what we're looking to do. And really making it so that we build those relationships so that there can be trust in terms of um, believing in the direction that you are recommending to go in. Dr. Lee, that you want to add something?
Yeah, you hit just about everything I was going to say. I'm gonna just add a little bit. Like I said, you're always phenomenal. Um,
Mhm.
and I've been remiss in my responsibility. I'll take care of that in just a minute. But to answer your question, one of the last thing that Leah said was the first thing that I was going to say, and that is establishing those relationships is going to be your It's going to be a make or break. And understanding the power relationships of the people who you speak with, regardless of where they're situated in your organization, is going to mean everything. Because every person in an organization has the possibility or a probability of allowing you to be successful. You can appreciate where he, she, or they sit in that space. So treat everyone as if they're the most valuable person on the planet every time you have a conversation with people. The next thing was this is a problem that happens many times when people are collecting even, diamonds for data. They don't do anything with it. Once you collect the data, do something. If you really want to irritate people in your organization, take the time to have these conversations, and they share with you, and they have a real, I'm going to say, promise for you doing great things and nothing happens, you're done. Because if they get the feeling that you've collected all this data, taken all this time to get that information, and then nothing comes of it, all your efforts after that are going to be for naught. The other thing, do not overpromise. If you're the first of your kind, you're going to have people coming to you trying to fix things that's been broken for decades. Make them understand the value in appreciating incremental progress, which is the best you can hope for going in. And listen more than you speak. You said you want a listening tour or listening something, I forget the phrase you use, but that is important. Listen more than you speak. And then when you do speak, make sure it's something that you can back up with substantial data, because you want to have something to support what you're providing as an idea. And the other thing you're going to understand is once you get your feet firm in the place, a lot of the things that you see as necessary, because it has no legacy and no evidence to support it, is only going to be supported if you've taken the time to establish that trust that Leah is talking about, because it's going to undergird everything that looks like and even resembles success where you are. If there's no trust in what you're doing, the key people, especially your leadership, whose vested interest in their success depends upon your success, is going to have to depend upon you to be able to deliver on what you say. So for that reason, I say do not overpromise whatever you do. Even though there may be money thrown at you and all kind of other opportunities, if and when said initiative is successful, still don't take the bait. Understand that what you're trying to do that's going to be success is going to take time and deliberate actions. The part in my remiss, I always recommend books. I'm going to do it now before we're running low on time. I wrote them down. There's one that I reread by Carol Dweck called Mindsets. Everyone talks about growth mindset and fixed mindset. You need to read the book because there's a lot of information that's critical to understanding how to operationalize those two things. The other one is How the Future Works by Brian Elliott. He's actually co-author, so it's more people with him, but he's the primary author. Another one is Neuroscience for Leadership. Take your time on that one. It's kind of dense. And that's by Tara, T-A-R-A Swart, S-W-A-R-T. And because we were talking about the necessity of generational communication, I believe she has some works out in articles, and it may be a book by her, but her name is Dr. Mary Donohue, D-O-N-O-H-E-U. She does phenomenal work and is deemed an expert in generational communication. So there.
And I'm just going to add here that when you're compiling your data and you're using your facts and figures and statistics, include those stories too. So you want to do research on those stories of different things that have happened in towns, of people who haven't been, towns that haven't been prepared, counties that haven't been prepared, inadequate responses from counties, such as looking at what happened in Flint, Michigan, what is happening in Flint, Michigan with the water and other places, how when we look at Parrish County and Louisiana, how they handled the flooding that they had after Hurricane Katrina. You want to look at those instances of those stories of how people did, and look at those case studies of how different counties, or if you're not a county, if you're a state, if you're a city, if you're a corporation, you want to look at those instances of inadequate responses, because that is going to help people to think differently about the work that you're doing. right? So that's part of your whole change strategy. That's going to be a key driver. You being able to engage in what we'll call storytelling, and making it so that storytelling is a major component of helping you to ensure that the work is being aligned, and people are adequately preparing and evaluating and measuring the work that they're doing. And then finally, we want to look at the next era of responsible marketing and what responsible marketing looks like in lieu of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and in the environment, social good, and corporate governance, right? What does responsible marketing really look like as we're pivoting and we're changing how we are going forward? Okay, so this next area is twofold. So I want you to think about uh, ingenuity for from a lot of different perspectives. On a personal level, I want you to think about ingenuity, but also on an organizational level. So, ingenuity is going to entail you being able to use technology and utilize technology, research different technological tools to predict environmental risk, but also for you to explore the impact of environmental bias, right? So let's talk about where bias may creep in to our processes when we're talking about ESG. There are a lot of organizations who are using technology for various organizational functions, such as recruiting, such as being able to um, do things as simple as, wash your hands at the sink. And as we're looking at all of these tools that are supposed to make our lives easier, in many cases, because there is a lack of diversity and a lack of representation, you may have tools that are what I call incomplete. So this is where we need to become more knowledgeable about what goes into the algorithms for these artificially intelligent systems and machines and processes, but also being able to, as Dr. Lee said a little bit earlier, ask questions. Ask questions, ask more questions, right? Seek to understand. And then making it so that we're talking about how the area of artificial intelligence will ultimately impact not only employees, as we're speaking about social good, but in that transparency piece, when we're not allowing, our organization to pretend like the reason why we're not hiring as many people is because we are using these DEIA initiatives, or we're implementing DEIA initiatives, and all the people of color and the women are taking your jobs, and that's why you don't have jobs. No, let's be honest. Let's talk about the role that technology has had in the changing of our workforce, but where we will still need to have workers, and how people need to upskill and need to upgrade their skills and reskill, right? Because one of the things that's happened at a lot of organizations is as they're adapting new technologies, they're realizing, hey, these people who were previously doing older things, we don't need them anymore. We need to get rid of them. Well, instead of being honest and transparent, you have these people who are like, oh, well, the reason why you're getting rid of me is because of diversity. No, that's not why. It's because you allowed your skills to become outdated.
Mhm.
So let's have those conversations about people, people's roles, and how things are going to be changing in the next couple of years, so that it gives people the opportunity to make the choice to upskill and reskill, right? So that they're not becoming irrelevant. So that they're not becoming individuals whose skills are no longer needed in the organization. You need to have other people who are continually learning and developing. Stop spending so much time online arguing with people about race and gender and sexual orientation, and spend some more time reading books and learning. Make it so that for those individuals who are starting businesses because they got laid off, encourage them to start businesses in areas that are up and coming, STEM areas, science, technology, engineering, um, math, even art, right? Because there is a need for people to come up with these new images, and people are, companies are buying these images for video games. They're buying these images for all sorts of different areas. Encourage people to start learning more about the environment. Encourage people to start learning more about AI, so that they can start businesses in these areas. And if they're not, business entrepreneurship isn't for everyone. It's tough, right? Entrepreneurship is tough. Instead of perhaps owning your own business, invest in businesses that are started by diverse individuals, right? Invest in those businesses and support them, so that way they can grow their enterprises. And also, when it comes to suppliers, make it so that people are thinking about partnering in non-traditional ways. Look outside the US for partners. If you're not getting contracts here in the US, fine. Go to Canada, go to Mexico, go to other countries in Europe. I mean, go to some European countries. That's a great time to take a trip. It can be business and personal pleasure, right? Start to think about non-traditional partnerships, even when it comes to uh, philanthropy, thinking about those nonprofit partnerships and making it so that we're getting creative in all of these different areas, and not just sitting there giving our power away to different people, but us using ingenuity to take our work, our efforts to the next level. Dr. Lee, did you want to add something?
Ugh, yes.
Really quick, Dr. Lee, before you start preaching, could you restate the names of the books, the 4 books that you listed that you were talking about
Oh,
earlier?
yes, yes. I'll go slow. I spoke kind of fast because I wanted to get it. Okay. The first book is a book I think it was written like, I don't know, 2006. But the first book was Mindset by Carol Dweck. Her last name is spelled Dweck. The next one was How the Future Works. And it's multiple authors, but the primary author is Brian Elliott. The third one was Neuroscience for Leadership. Very good read, by the way, because it talks about how people makes decisions and what drives them. But uh, her name is Tara, T-A-R-A Swart, S-W-A-R-T. The fourth person that I mentioned, she may have written books. I don't know, but I know she's written papers. But her name was Dr. Carol. No, Dr. Mary Donohue, Donohue. And if you Google her, she's recognized as an expert in generational communication. And as I said before, we were talking about the language and how we communicate in the workplace, and the necessity of it as we talk about establishing trust. And that triggered my thought for any of us to actually learn how each generation communicates, such that when we speak with people, they're actually able to respond because we don't aggress them accidentally. And because people perceive the world through the lens through which they were value programmed, understanding a little bit about them as you speak will make your communication that much more effective. Hopefully that was it. The piggyback on what Leah said, I always look at the time. I cherry picked them. First of all, AI, don't be afraid of it. Chat GPT scared people to death when it was first introduced. My thing is to lean into the technology such you can understand its limitations. And there are limitations to AI. Until it approaches what's called general intelligence, it is not a threat to you if you're doing as Leah said, if you're staying informed, if you understand the value of upskilling and keeping your skills constantly growing and staying informed, you will always be informed and be gainfully employed. Because here's the thing I want you all to realize. I was trying to think, I got like 5 books going, but one of them I was reading was talking about the transitioning of the ages. Like went from the industrial age to all of those things. And the last age we were in was the knowledge age. But pay attention because this is what's happening right before you and you're part of it. And sometimes because we're so immersed in it, we don't realize what it is that we're doing. But we're right now transitioning to what's called a people development age. If you think about our conversation today and many of the things that you're reading, it all centers around valuing people. DEIA, ESG, CSR, the hunt for talent acquisition. We're trying to recruit more and more Zoomers and millennials and even the adult learners back into the university because it's all about people and how to work effectively with them and appreciate the value of people in the equation of success. So understanding that people development mindset is going to be critical going forward for 2 reasons. One, it's necessary. And 2, AI cannot duplicate this. It's not there yet. So if you're involved in an endeavor that has to do with people, you're increasing the probability of being gainfully employed going into the future. How's that for being brief?
Right. And you know, I think because in many cases we don't understand the technology, um, we may give technology more credit than what it deserves. If you think about some of the electric cars, um, there were some towns and some cities that have said, you know what, we want to make it so that we're, you know, making more room for electric cars. So let's do charging stations and let's do all these different things. And yes, that is something that will lead to innovation and encourage innovation and let people know that you're forward thinking, but you also have to mitigate the risk that are associated with perhaps a car fire, or perhaps uh, someone who, you know, is using the self-driving car feature, and they're not actively holding on to the steering wheel, and perhaps they cause an accident in a high traffic area. So we want to be more proactive in kind of thinking about um, this whole idea of innovation and also risk. And that brings us to this final slide where we are talking about improving risk management. Um, Certainly, one of the biggest areas that is risky is thinking about not doing anything in DEIA. That's risky because again, you run the risk of creating more competitors and making it so that your organization is not relevant to the future. There is uh, there is no doubt that DEIA is the future, period. It's regardless of how many people want to argue about it now, how many people want to debate it, want to fight it, there's no doubt that DEIA is the future. No doubt. And even if it is hard for us to create the systems and the structures that will ultimately help all of these diverse groups to function well, the reality is that doing nothing is a bigger risk than making the wrong mistake. You know, making a mistake. It's a risk. It's a risk because, again, even if you think about something like accessibility, if your organization, wait, so let's think about this realistically. Right now, there's over 1 billion people in the world who have um, who have a disability. Over 1 billion people. That's more individuals than are in the United States.
Yeah.
We're we are we're so let's say, for instance, that we have this this looming aging population, which means that there's going to be an increase in people who have disabilities. So just imagine that you're not planning adequately for accessibility, and there is an environmental disaster that your organization is preparing for, and you haven't even thought about how you're going to get the people who are not mobile out of the town or out of the county in a timely manner, right? So let's start to make it so that we're normalizing these conversations and ensuring that people are not afraid to talk about the things that need to be talked about, whether we're looking at someone who has a disability or a caregiver, or even someone who is low income, or someone who is perhaps um, someone that doesn't speak English well, or whatever it is. Let's make it so that we're prioritizing and combining our conversations and normalizing our conversations about DEIA. That means that you got to take back the narrative and you've got to equip other people to know how to take back that narrative. Dr. Lee, did you want to add something on this last slide?
Um, mm, well, I could, but we got to wrap it up. I just stress the fact that the standardized metrics is going to be an advantage because it's going to allow us to deal with one problem that's been a part of our DEI work, and that was that people who are what I call very quantifiably minded, bean counters, whatever, have always said, well, how's it going to affect my bottom line? Well, through these metrics, you actually have a process to measure your DEI efforts. Through the regulatory guidance that's going to be provided through the SEC, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Labor, you're going to get specific um, processes and guidelines to ensure that as we talk about our improvement in the environmental space and what we're doing for equity treatment in the workplace, that there will be a scorecard that every person can actually view. So we have quantifiable measures to indicate exactly the successes that we do and how it can impact the bottom line.
Well, thank you everyone for participating today. Certainly, we want you to kind of think about all of these different things that we talked about, and then let us know what you want to learn more about, because this is definitely going to be um, the next generation of our work, and we're going to have to dive in deeper, right? We're going to have to make sure that we stay focused on the future, and ESG plus DEIA is the future. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for participating today, and I hope that you enjoyed our conversation.